On June 22, 1941, the Germans launched what would become the largest land invasion in history. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the German plan called for more than 3 million soldiers to sweep aside the Red Army and capture the Soviet Union in just a few months. But the Soviets had prepared for a German attack and were ready to fight back, as the German army advanced deep into Soviet territory. It quickly encountered fierce resistance, suffering staggering casualties. Hitler's dream of a swift victory in the East soon turned into a nightmare, as his forces became bogged down in the vast, inhospitable terrain of Russia. So how did the Soviets manage to stop the Nazi war machine? And why did Operation Barbarossa ultimately fail? This is the story of when 3 million soldiers stormed the East and how the Soviets fought back. The year is 1941. Adolf Hitler had conquered most of Europe. His panzer divisions have rolled through Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and the British. Even the Italians have joined the party, occupying parts of Yugoslavia and Greece. But Hitler isn't done yet. He wants more. The only problem is that he doesn't really know where to go next. There are some strategic territories still outside of his control, like England and the rest of the British Empire. But these targets are located across the North Sea, or protected by the Royal Navy. The Atlantic Ocean also poses a bit of a problem. Not only would a German invasion of Britain require a cross-channel attack, but an invasion of the United States would be nearly impossible without conquering the sea. But there was one last option, one final piece of the puzzle: the Soviet Union. In the late 1930s, Hitler began to take notice of the Soviet Union. Not only did Stalin's regime represent an ideological threat to National Socialism, but it was also a potential economic resource that could help Germany prepare for a future war. On August 23, 1939, Hitler and Stalin met in Moscow to discuss the possibility of a non-aggression pact between the two nations. Within a few weeks, the two dictators had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which not only avoided war between the two nations, but also secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. While the pact lasted, Hitler would eventually break it and launch an invasion of the Soviet Union, which he would codename Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's plan was relatively simple. In the first phase of the war, the Germans would strike deep into Soviet territory with their elite panzer divisions, advancing as far as possible. Behind them, other units would follow at a slower pace. Once the Germans reached their furthest point, they would then turn around and secure their supply lines, establishing a defensive line from which they could launch further offensives. Hitler's goal was to reach the Ural Mountains, where he believed that the Soviets would collapse. With their industrial base in the Urals secured, the Germans would then have access to the natural resources of the Caucasus region, including oil fields that could fuel the German war machine for years to come. It was an ambitious plan, to say the least. However, Hitler was convinced that the Soviets would be unable to stop him. In the summer of 1941, the Germans assembled a massive invasion force comprising more than 3 million soldiers, over 600 tanks, and more than 7,000 artillery pieces. The German army consisted of 3 main components, each with its own unique role. The first was the shock troops, consisting of 40 elite panzer divisions tasked with rapidly advancing deep into enemy territory. These units were supported by the second component, the infantry divisions, whose job was to mop up any remaining resistance and secure the rear of the advancing panzers. Finally, there were the Army Corps, whose job it was to follow behind the infantry and establish the supply and communication lines needed to sustain the German war machine. With 3 times as many soldiers as the Soviets, 3 times as many tanks, and with their forces already spread out along a 1,700-mile front, the Germans were confident that they would be able to achieve a quick victory. All that was left to do was wait for the signal. In June 1941, after signing the order for the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler flew to Berlin to watch the operation commence. At 3 a.m., the Germans began bombarding Soviet border fortifications, allowing their ground forces to advance. Within a few hours, the entire Eastern Front was ablaze with the fires of war. Over the next few days, the German army advanced quickly, smashing through the unprepared Soviets and racing towards the interior of the USSR. By July, the Germans controlled all of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and most of Belarus. Even worse for the Soviets, more than 500,000 men had either been captured or killed. But something odd was beginning to happen. Hitler's forces were taking much heavier casualties than expected, and his supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. Although the panzer divisions had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, the supporting infantry divisions were struggling to keep up, forcing the mobile units to slow their advance in order to protect their flanks. Worse still, the Soviet Air Force was putting up a fierce fight, slowing down the pace of the German advance even further. What Hitler hadn't anticipated was the ferocity of the Soviet resistance. Despite their massive losses, the Red Army had managed to regroup and launch a series of counterattacks, pushing the Germans back from some positions. Hitler was horrified. His generals told him that the Soviets would collapse within weeks, not months. Clearly, something had gone terribly wrong. As the German army advanced deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, the situation began to deteriorate even further. As supplies dwindled and Soviet resistance stiffened, the Germans found themselves in a desperate race against time. They needed to establish a proper supply line to the front before the Soviets could launch a major counterattack. Although the Germans had advanced more than 200 miles deep into the Soviet Union, they had almost no supply infrastructure in place. This meant that their ability to wage war was extremely limited. Unable to replace their depleted stocks of food and ammunition, the German army was forced to retreat from some positions while desperately racing to secure their existing gains. By September, the Germans had established a defensive line roughly 200 miles from the Soviet border, which they hoped would stabilize the front until reinforcements and supplies arrived from Germany. This marked the end of Operation Barbarossa, at least for the year. Despite suffering more than 700,000 casualties, the German army had failed to reach the Ural Mountains, let alone conquer the Soviet Union. In fact, they had barely made any progress at all. As winter approached, the fighting gradually came to a halt. The Germans spent the cold months digging defensive trenches, while the Soviets used the time to regroup and rearm. Why did the Germans fail? The first reason was their failure to destroy the Soviet leadership and their military infrastructure during the opening weeks of the war. Because of this, the Soviets were able to mount an effective defense once their initial shock wore off. Second, the Germans had severely underestimated the vastness of the Soviet Union. Not only was the country larger than they had anticipated, but its terrain was also much more varied. The Germans had assumed that their panzer divisions would be able to drive straight to the Urals, but the reality was much different. The Soviets had prepared defensive lines throughout the country, which slowed down the German advance. Finally, Hitler had miscalculated the strength of the Red Army. Because of the purge of the 1930s, when Stalin had executed or imprisoned thousands of his former officers, the Germans expected the Soviet ranks to crumble at the first sign of resistance. But despite severe setbacks, the Soviets had managed to put together one of the largest standing armies in history. Today, Operation Barbarossa is widely considered to be the largest land invasion in the history of warfare. Although other invasions may have involved more troops, none have ever taken place over such long distances or in such a short period of time. On June 22, 2021, the Russian Ministry of Defense held a military parade to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the German invasion. President Vladimir Putin attended the event, which featured more than 100 pieces of military hardware, including T-72 tanks and Ka-52 helicopters. Speaking at the event, Putin described the Soviet victory as the triumph of good over evil. He also slammed NATO as being responsible for the outbreak of World War II. According to Putin, the Western powers provoked Hitler into invading the Soviet Union by refusing to negotiate with him over Poland. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. On June 22, 1941, the world would never be the same again. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you want to catch our upcoming videos.